You've been lied to about being lied to about Paleolithic women. So this is kind of a cautionary tale about YouTube videos. It's kind of a response video, criticism video, if you will. This video, for some context, I saw it when it came out, and I had the discernment, the domain knowledge necessary to say, this doesn't seem right. There's some issues with this video. Okay. And then I kind of forgot about it. I made this like slideshow as a first draft, and I was like, maybe I'll talk about it, talk about some larger points. And yeah, I forgot about it. So then I came back a month later, had 1 million views. I was like, okay, maybe I, should uh, make a video about this. Seems like it's an important topic people care about. So, try and watch this video before this one. I think that's, kind of requisite knowledge. You got to study before you watch this video. I'm recording this after the fact, but the streets were asking for clips, so I'm blessing y'all with some clips.
Back when I was debating on TikTok full-time, I would most often cover subjects that related to feminism and sexual dimorphism. For context, the debate topic was, quote, "Men are not inherently better leaders than women, and vice versa." The title of the live conversation was meant to push back against biases that often favored men in leadership roles, while largely excluding women. We usually call this phenomenon patriarchy. People would call in and argue that men simply possessed qualities that women did not, and that these qualities set men up from birth to simply be better leaders than women. One of the ways I debunked these arguments was through presenting evidence of egalitarianism within prehistoric hunter-gatherer societies, particularly that of Paleolithic Homo sapiens.
So her argument against this kind of her rebuttal is that we should attack the notion or the misconception that these societies were hierarchical or patriarchal in the past. So that's what we're going to go into this video looking like. Okay. So the first topic is the economy of an argument. So have you ever heard an argument that was rhetorically effective but not really true? Okay, so you may have seen like a gotcha. It's like kind of lowest form of this kind of argument, right? So doesn't really engage with the argument or any of its facts or whatever. It's just kind of a gotcha, right? But the more sophisticated version of this kind of rhetoric is that it has some truth to it, but it's not exactly fully true. It's not nuanced, I guess. It's missing some pieces of the puzzle, right? So, for an argument, you have to kind of balance this rhetoric and its truthfulness. And I think it'll become apparent later on that a lot of these videos, were used from a TikTok debate, basically. So, I was on a very long point in my original video about this, how we should believe true things and believing in consistent systems and not outsourcing your belief to people who, use rhetoric to make their points, But overall, I think most people care about the truth, okay? So I'll engage in this video kind of like a debate, I'll kind of be arguing against some of its points with evidence and such, okay? And I think this video is a little, maybe it's a stretch to say it's lying, but I think it's kind of disingenuous. It's kind of dressed up scientifically when it's really a rhetorical piece, okay? So yeah. Okay, so the first thing I noticed about the video was EP, and EP is evolutionary psychology. Many people don't like evolutionary psychology. They think it's a bad field. It's at the very least, it's controversial. Yeah, it's criticized as having just so stories, right? So a just so story is using the past or the present to infer details about the past, right? So the elephant has its trunk now, so the elephant must have got its trunk in the past, basically. Here's an example, I guess. Here's a plausible PhD thesis you could use free of charge, okay? So people today watch TV. So in the past, when the monkeys were picking lice out of each other's hair, that kind of group bonding activity kind of is evolutionarily wired inside of us psychologically. So therefore, humans kind of watch TV because of this evolutionary past, right? So it's evolutionarily selected for, basically. It's kind of bonding activity, right? But of course, we're using the present to infer details about the past, right? Okay. And but of course, this video is talking about inherent stuff, right? Men are not inherently better leaders than women, right? So that has details, history, biology. You can't exactly conjecture about that as much, right? There's evidence at play. So I guess we're going to see how this video plays out, right? But, you know, yeah. Okay, anyway, so leadership, the question uses the term better leaders, right? Better leaders. And I think, leadership is a very maligned field, okay? It's disrespected all day and night, okay? I think it's a nice field, okay? I think it, maybe deserves perhaps a little bit more care, okay? And I just want to talk about it just for a little bit, okay, chill. And it's a cool field, engaged with gender regularly, okay? So, but basically the debate, leadership is just a proxy for patriarchy, so who cares, right? But leadership is interesting, okay? Like if men and women are different and leadership has context, then wouldn't men be better in some contexts than women? Okay, maybe not. And we'll get into this a little bit more later, but formal hierarchies versus influence based on expertise, that's a distinction the original author makes, right?
None of these species show evidence of formal hierarchies like that of chiefs or kings or queens or monarchs in any way. Those discussions happened collectively. Someone with expertise, someone who knew the trails, the seasonal patterns, where the fruit trees were, might have had influence in that moment, but they couldn't command.
And this is kind of an anarchist critique, right? I mean, you may have heard it before. That's kind of why I think this video is borrowing from other debates, because I see this kind of talking point a lot, right? I've debated a little bit in the past. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense, right? This is on the face of it, it makes no sense. Like, influence based on expertise is what exactly? It's leadership, right? Subject matter expertise can be a form of leadership, even if there's no formal title behind it, right? So let's say, example, elders, right? Elders might not have a formal title, but they might have respect. Many societies have a form of elder respect, right? So, they have authority in everything but the title, right? So that's just the argument there. Pretty simple. Hopefully you can see it, right? Like elders have a lot of respect. Kids don't get any respect, so society has more stuff like that. And here's actually an example. So the author of the video, they say, well, Neanderthals, they cared for people, they showed cooperation, empathy, and blah, blah, blah.
We have evidence that Neanderthals in particular cared for their sick and injured. Fossils show individuals surviving for years with severe disabilities, which likely means that the group was supporting them, showing a very clear history of collaboration and communal care, rather than necessarily overt dominance. But we'll dive deeper into that in a moment.
But, like, do we know that? We really don't know that. Maybe the elder had respect in the society, therefore they were coerced to do it or something, Can we infer that? Maybe we can't, To infer from those examples about what they were thinking is kind of a bad idea, I think. And anyway, they also say, confusingly, they say overt dominance was not at play when describing how Neanderthals cared for their sick, right? And like, what does that even mean? Like in an overtly dominant society, they would kill the sick and injured? That doesn't make any sense, right? Like overt dominance or hierarchy doesn't necessarily mean like utilitarianism or brutality or whatever. Kind of a nonsense point on their part, but okay, let's keep going. Okay, so here is actually evidence of late Pleistocene formal hierarchies, right? I mean, one issue with a lot of YouTube videos in this kind of pseudo-educational style is that their evidence is super new in some areas, but also really old. Like Christopher Bowman, the main source of the video, Reverse Dominance Hierarchy, is pretty old. I think it's like in the 90s or 80s, right? But a lot of other evidence, like a lot of the penicillin stuff and the carrying, it's very new evidence. Kind of weird. Why hasn't their evidence updated? It's because they want to make a point. They want to make a rhetorically sound point. They don't want to have evidence that contradicts their point, right? So yeah, I mean, they have some quotes here.
I want to note here that a formal hierarchy did not exist until the Neolithic era, after the agricultural revolution. For the vast majority of human existence, Paleolithic groups had no formal leaders at all.
I want to note here that a formal hierarchy did not exist until the Neolithic era. So they're trying to promote this Neolithic invention of hierarchy, which is going to later flow down into their explanation of patriarchy, right? So Nice rhetorical building here, but not exactly, true, right? Ever since 2000, right? Many authors have argued for more complex or sophisticated arguments, right? So Graeber, very popular author, he kind of argues immediately against the point the author makes near the end, which is there is no Garden of Eden, there's no utopia, egalitarian society, but there actually were temporary kings, even formal titles. They use the word king here, and and they offer like an economic or ecological argument, so like a surplus argument basically for why hierarchy may emerge temporarily or seasonally, etc. Okay, right. Yeah, comparative primatology, I think is kind of a midpoint, honestly. I mean, not that effective because primatology, you can say they had hierarchy, right? So isn't it likely humans had hierarchy, right? Or, but like whatever, right? It can go either way, basically. And so empirically, maybe the strongest point here, I already kind of mentioned some empirics, but other authors have argued kind of damning for the Christopher Bohm supporters is that he kind of cherry picked the data, right? He excluded low mobility or complex hunter-gatherers from his database of his egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, with which he was going to base his research off of. So, I mean, kind of a little damning for the egalitarian evidence, right? Maybe the past is more sophisticated than we thought, right? Maybe trying to infer the past from present circumstances is kind of a flawed approach, maybe kind of mistaken. And anyway, so the authors, they argue for this diverse histories model, which is they're more sedentary, unequal, large, politically stratified, so kind of opposite to the mobile hunter-gatherer band kind of perspective. And that's really the mainstream, actually. We'll get into that though later. Anyway, yeah, so hunter-gatherer societies may or may not have been egalitarian, and then displacement due to agriculture and historical circumstances like colonization may have made present hunter-gatherers, which was Bohm observed, they may have seemed egalitarian even though in the past they may have not been, right? So it may actually be the present that is we're ignoring factors that may complicate our analysis, right? But you might say, okay, well, who cares, right? I mean, this is just evidence versus evidence, right? We don't know who's right. We don't know which evidence is really the best evidence. You can just say, well, my evidence is better than your evidence, right? Well, here's maybe a better argument, right? So methodologically, Bohm's argument is not really sound, right? It's circular. It's a just so story, right? We're using present circumstances to infer the past, which is also justifies the present, right? So ironically, the thesis of the video, we're trying to disprove the right side of the flowchart, right? So men occupy leadership, so we have to justify that by going to nature and looking to this kind of fake past, which this man the hunter-esque pressures would make man biologically more leadership worthy than women, right? So that's the argument we're trying to argue against, right, in this original video. But we make the counter argument, which is equally as circular, right? It's contemporary hunter-gatherer societies are egalitarian, right? We observed that in Bohm. He cherry-picked, you could say. And then societies then face similar pressures and were likely egalitarian. Therefore, male leadership is a recent phenomenon, right? It's something else. It's not biological. So ironic, right? Wow. And so kind of the conclusion of that whole saga is that even if the past were as described, so even if the past were patriarchal, or even if it was egalitarian, that wouldn't tell us what we should value today. So like why even go down this path to answer the original question, Really, it's kind of just a facet or a way for the author to talk about anthropology, which they probably like. So, I mean, no shade against him, but I think the rhetorical framing of this video makes this topic kind of dishonest when you just want to talk about anthropology. Okay, anyway, so you might say the video is arguing against the naturalistic fallacy, right? So, but it's not actually, because at the end of the video they do the naturalistic fallacy, right? They say so.
So the next time you hear someone tell you that they would never vote for a woman, think back to a time before the last 5% of human history and ask yourself if that sentiment still feels correct.
Which is naturalistic, right? They're making the same mistake as the the man in the original hypothetical. Anyway, yeah, so historical fiction. I love evolutionary psychology because you can just claim things and then conjecture examples about how things may have gone down. You get to borrow credibility from archaeology and other, more uh, concrete natural sciences, right? You get to borrow their credibility and their empirical basis, right? So, for example, the Grug and hot pepper example, I think is very anachronistic. We don't know if Grug was, beholden to the bicameral brain. Maybe the God voice was telling him to do all that kind of stuff. You know, um,
Let me draw this out with a hypothetical really quick. Let's take Grug. He's big, he's tough, he's full of ideas. After being particularly proud of a successful hunt, he's decided that he wanted to take the best cuts of meat for himself. It's my kill, he thinks to himself, sitting on his rock, eating the best of the meat. The group initially does not engage in conflict. Grug is a big dude, but the next morning, when Grug wakes up, nobody shares their food with him. Grug is being socially erased. But Grug should not care about this, says the third party. Grug is a big tough guy, and a big tough guy takes what he wants. Except big tough guys cannot survive alone. Dark day, but it's a necessary one to get the ultimate message across. We will not be ruled.
and I think the framing is kind of bad, right? It'd be very ironic later on. I'll kind of show you, but this kind of confirmation, this kind of affirmative language, humans do something wildly different, right? That is kind of damaging, I think. It's kind of, trickle down economics to the layperson. They're going to believe, okay, humans really did do something wildly different than other, bonobos or primates, right? Even though that's really just a theory. We have a theory humans do something wildly different, right? So I think it's a little bad. It's going to filter down to the mainstream and it's going to pollute their minds. Okay, here's a minor point, basically. They use evidence that doesn't make any sense, right? They say women had injuries similar to modern day rodeo clowns, right? They have a lot of injuries, which doesn't really make any sense, right? How does that make any sense? Because we all learned in fourth grade that persistence hunting is like they run the prey down, not exactly fighting the prey hands on. And even if they were, the prey would be very exhausted, right? Doesn't make any sense. It's because they use ambush style hunting, so it's kind of a point in their favor, right? More strong evidence that women engage in hunting, right? Just more evidence that subsistence was a non-gendered activity. Anyway, yeah, so on the topic of cherry picking data, right? I was in the original cut, I included while men have competitive edge in most sports, endurance running is very close, and in ultramarathons, women can often beat men, which I learned was actually a misconception upon researching this video, right? And, if you're wondering why I have all these kind of points at the bottom, it's because I have bad memory. Okay, chill. And yeah, so I have some stats on the side here. Yeah, so these uncommon kind of stories, these man bites dog stories, where a woman beats the men in a ultra marathon. It kind of make people eventually believe that maybe women will overtake men in the marathon because the marathon was a male only event. So after enough time, if the trend holds out and women eventually beat men, because women have endurance and men are like race cars and power and stuff like that. But, recent research maybe is kind of putting some doubt in that idea, right? It's not exactly going to prove out, probably, right? The gap is really widening. So, I mean, do we really have to kind of draw these dichotomies, right? These like women are endurance machines and men. The analogy isn't complete in the video, but the usual thing is men are built for power and speed and stuff like that. So, yeah, do we have to make these dichotomies, right? I mean, humans are built for endurance. That's kind of a human trait, not exactly a female trait, right? Okay. And here's the largest point that I learned in the making of this video. Do some research. I was like, some of these points don't make any sense, right? Why would the co-organizer present evidence that is contradictory and offer no explanation? That doesn't make any sense, right? What's that about? And so the video kind of presents like these key and Peele anthropologists, these like only human men hunted, therefore human man society was patriarchal basically. and hierarchical and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it's the
biggest, most popular lie that we call man the hunter tragically became the foundation for decades of bad science about gender and human evolution. The conference proceedings were unfortunately published in a book in 1968, quickly becoming the dominant framework in anthropology for many decades, often even bleeding into modern conversation about our Paleolithic ancestry. Museums based their exhibits around it, textbooks taught it as fact, and it shaped everything.
and the lay person got infected with this horrible diseased ideology, right? I mean, that's kind of the impression I came away with this video, right? I mean, isn't that kind of weird, right? I mean, isn't it kind of weird this event, which is described as a high point in its particular science, it describes a high point, right? It's described as the progenitor of its field of studies of hunter-gatherer studies, right? That's kind of odd, don't you think? I mean, um, Richard B. Lee, they cite Richard B. Lee actually. He presented the evidence that was contrary, right? He described hunter-gatherers as fiercely egalitarian. Isn't that weird? They actually, they present the idea that hunter-gatherers are mobile and egalitarian, as opposed, to the dominant view, which I'll go through right now. But the dominant view is that the Hobbesian view. Man devolves to a state of nature without government, and their lives were solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, right? Cavemen were simple creatures, right? So then this symposium was organized, and this person, they're so being disingenuous, right? They put conference in quotation marks. They try and discredit it at every opportunity, right? And the comments eat it up hook, line, and sinker, right? Anyways, the first symposium to provide a comprehensive overview of recent research. It's interdisciplinary, 75 people, okay, a lot of people, right? You might think, okay, one person, 70 men, 5 women, right? So bias is there. They say hunting, separated by the sexual division of labor, right? Drove tool use, bipedalism, language, cooperation, etc. It was the key evolutionary pressure, right?
Hunting large game was the defining human behavior that separated us from all the other primate species. They claimed that it's what made us smart and creative and capable. Because the assumption was that only men hunted, their conclusion was that male behavior specifically drove human evolution forward.
And it was anti-Hobbesian, right? So they argued against it. Humans were creatures of leisure. They worked 15, 20 hours a week. They foraged a lot of their food. They were affluent, right? Work is play, and many of these kind of big ideas that we are maybe all familiar with, hopefully. And then, about 15 years later, I mean, decades of bad science. I mean, this is 10 years later, right? Woman the Gatherer comes out, and this video is actually kind of summarizing Woman the Gatherer, I guess. It's kind of presenting the kind of similar feminist archaeological argument, basically. Anyway, yeah, so Richard Lee, he says the counterposing of Woman the Gatherer to Man the Hunter has been part of a welcome and long overdue reexamination of the implicit and explicit male biases in anthropology. All right? I mean, what's that about? What is that about? And yeah, so the kind of main thing I came away with is this video kind of uses Boehm's reverse dominance hierarchy as kind of a rhetorical tool, basically, to kind of suggest that it's kind of this counter to the mainstream, this kind of egalitarian, non-hierarchical viewpoint, when in reality it's he's actually kind of building upon the nomadic egalitarian model set forth in this synthetic event, right? And here's another point they make.
But they literally had evidence at the symposium that contradicted their own thesis.
60 to 80% of, I think, food was foraged, basically, is the evidence they're talking about. And, they address that, right? Hunting can be the key evolutionary pressure without it being the primary form of calories, right? And you can even make this more universal, right? Non-gendered, if you want to say it's meat desire or meat sharing, actually, is even a more universal argument, essentially. Of course, the title of the symposium, the book, etc., very biased, right? Man the hunter, women are devalued. I mean, they do devalue women, or they don't devalue women, but they devalue the gathering as, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, that's all bias and stuff, but hunting as a pressure kind of doesn't this conference even reinforce your original point, the author, right? because men and women both engaged in hunting, right? So doesn't this kind of help your argument actually? Wouldn't a more honest view of this conference or symposium help your argument? No, because they want a boogeyman. So I've made this amazing flowchart here. So basically, I think I've kind of gone through the supporting evidence. It's kind of mid, frankly, and essentially they kind of frame this popular misconceptions, popular mainstream narrative of this hierarchical past, right? This patriarchal view. Then we kind of introduce this anti-hierarchy position, this reverse dominance hierarchy thing, and then we introduce this patriarchal kind of androcentric man the hunter thing. And they say the ideology, this patriarchy behind it, kind of bled into common ideas. So you kind of have this loop here where you kind of get the idea that this popular misconception comes from Man the Hunter, when in reality, Man the Hunter actually is the intellectual history for reverse dominance hierarchy, right? So very interesting, I guess. I think it's a little unknown. I mean, the viewer wouldn't come away with this kind of perspective, I think, without doing more research. And yeah, more points anyway. So why patriarchy? Again, Graeber actually, the quote I shared earlier addresses this. To depict it as a Garden of Eden or
That changed when the agricultural nation attacked. We went from cooperative, flexible systems where everyone participated in the burden of childcare to isolated nuclear families where women were tied to the home.
egalitarian paradise, communal utopia, where they devolved into this invention, the Neolithic invention of isolated nuclear families. Again, very anachronistic perspective here. Very modernist, presentist, They show the Code of Hammurabi, which I think is very inaccurate to the point they're trying to make about women being seen as property.
Even the women, which, if the theory of property and inheritance is correct, were also at the time seen as property.
And they say the division of labor argument is weak, which I don't think it's weak. And they even say, quote,
due to the fact that there is some circular reasoning happening within it.
Kind of ironic, their argument is circular. Okay. And some more random errors in the video. They address the first error, but not the second error. But I mean, the second error is kind of they said about 20, which I think is kind of a stretch, frankly, right? 15 is kind of the upper end, right? If you really count, that's really it, though. It's kind of a short slide. And then we have audience testimony. Okay, so they think social issues should be discussed in this kind of rhetorical framing, right? This kind of objective look at the behavior, when it wasn't really objective, right? It was kind of rhetorically poised for the conclusion from the beginning. And they say, oh man, opinions and systems are influenced by bias, when this video is biased, right? And I was susceptible to the same kind of pro-feminist mythology. Essentially, I included that little factoid about a woman being endurance and stuff, which is wrong. Actually, I learned. And this person says my brain gained a wrinkle, even though the brain didn't gain a wrinkle. They lost a wrinkle. Yeah, I mean, not really though. But although most people are not commenting, I appreciate the educational transparency and the link sources, even though I think this video is kind of doing a disservice to its sources, right? It's very recent in its analysis, and I think it's pseudo-educational, etc. It cleared their wrong-headed assumptions. This kind of language is just so telling, frankly. And I don't link any sources. Okay, do your own work, but chill out. Okay. And yeah, so I'm going to patent this new form of thinking, right? So you have the mainstream narrative, which is this kind of simplistic boogeyman to argue against. Then you have your equally simplistic counter narrative. So you have your idea and your anti-idea, and then if you combine them, you get kind of a richer idea, a better perspective, a nuanced perspective. And this kind of new form of thinking, which nobody else is allowed to copy, I think is going to do big work for history, economics, and much other stuff. Yeah, so that's the video. Yeah, so in conclusion, I guess I'll circle back to this point about the video being reused from TikTok debates. That's kind of the main thing about this video, right? It's rhetorically very effective. It makes a very sound point. I showed this video to my friend, and he was like, "This video looks super mid," but then he's like, "Oh, it's so evidence-based and it's so interesting." And then he came away with the same kind of misconceptions I think I came away with originally too. And yeah, so I think really should try and balance. We can be rhetorically effective and really nuanced. Anyway, yeah. So why do I think this video is being reused from TikTok debates? I think because I got a feeling. I felt a disturbance in the patriarchy. Not really, but I kind of saw a lot of little tells in the video. I saw the kind of graphic here, which is kind of very non-specific, kind of just. I mean, it doesn't really make any sense, honestly. But just kind of pointing at the power of estrogen, basically, like the functions in the body of it, and it's like, okay, um, you know, it's just very like little pop-up, little infographics, these kind of popular myths and retellings and stuff. It's all just very as a whole. It kind of reads to me as a TikTok debate. I don't approve. I don't watch this person. I've never heard this person before, but that's why. Okay, that's why I said that. And yeah, I mean, that's really it. That's kind of the video. Okay, I'll see you later.